They viewed Kennedy as a traitor. But he was getting set to disassemble the primary military capacity that the United States had, doing it covertly with the Soviets, i.e. Khrushchev personally. Okay? And they said, that's it, that's curtains.
Do you think that the CIA killed JFK?
Not exactly.
Okay.
Not exactly. But I do know who did kill him, you know, and I do know that it was an S-force, it was a 15-man force that was created back in 1960, actually, by Richard Nixon.
And this was the force created to go after Castro?
Kill Castro, to kill Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, Che Guevara, and 5 particular comandantes of the new government.
And so why did Nixon create this force?
To kill Castro. He realized well, actually what he did, strangely enough, is he called Howard Hughes. Was the day that Nelson Rockefeller withdrew from the Michigan state primary in the Republican presidential primary campaign, was the day that Richard Nixon knew he was going to be the Republican nominee in 1960. Okay, and he knew that this Kennedy kid, whose father, you know, had basically bought him a seat, you know, in the Congress, and that he was this kind of, you know, hollow vehicle, you know, he was going to beat him. And so what he did is picks up the telephone, the security phone in the 5412 committee of the National Security Council, and calls Howard Hughes, because Howard Hughes was a secret consultant to the National Security Council. He'd invented the Glomar Explorer to pick up Russian submarines if they fail and fall to the bottom of the ocean. He did the C-5A cargo plane, the big Spruce Goose, and he was doing 2 other extremely sensitive programs.
What was he doing?
I can't tell you that, but the bottom line is he was close in.
Well, he must have been working on UFO stuff too.
No, he was not.
He wasn't?
He was not. No, they hadn't gotten him in on that. He was doing things much more kind of military, kind of prosaic military stuff. So the bottom line is Nixon knew him because of that, because Nixon chaired the 5412 committee as the vice president under Eisenhower in 1960. So he chaired that 5412 committee that's in charge of covert operations. So he knew about him being there. And so he picks up the red phone and calls Howard Hughes and tells Hughes that he wants him to set up an assassination team to kill Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and Che Guevara, because they're refusing Nixon's demands being communicated to them that they not have any diplomatic relations with either Russia or China. He was setting that up as a condition. You know, he was invoking basically the old Monroe Doctrine. What he did is ask him to set up an assassination team. He asked Howard Hughes to do that. Howard Hughes didn't agree or disagree on the phone, being smart enough not to trust Nixon as to whether he was recording it or not. And so he didn't say yes or no, but he called in one of his lawyers, Bob Mayhew, and assigned it to Mayhew to figure out how we might do this. And so Mayhew goes, and they were in Las Vegas, where they were, right? And he goes, and Robert Mayhew goes to see Johnny Roselli. And Johnny Roselli is the bag man at the 2 casinos that were owned by the mafia, right? And his principal is in Chicago. He goes to see him, right? Sam Giancana, and says, look, so Mayhew goes to Johnny Roselli and says, look, you guys with the bent noses, you know, you got your own reason for wanting to get rid of Castro. You know, he closed down all the gambling casinos, he closed down the whorehouses, and very importantly, he closed off the heroin trafficking that was coming in through the Golden Triangle. Okay, and so therefore you got your own reasons for wanting to get rid of them. So why don't you guys do that? That Nixon's getting set to be president. He wants you to do this. And so he says, well, I can't do it without talking to Giancana, who's my principal. So he goes back to Chicago and talks to Giancana. Giancana says, well, wait a second, this is Trafficante's territory down there. He's the Don of the Mafia in Havana. And even though he fled from Havana, on January 1st of 1959 when Castro took over. So he fled and came up to Florida and was camped out in Tampa, setting up his little regime there. And a whole bunch of the other refugees that were Batista people, you know, along with Trafficante, because they were partners in the heroin trade. Batista, the dictator,
Predecessor to Castro.
He was the dictator. He was partners with Santos Trafficante in the heroin operation. And the third guy in the partnership was Paul Helliwell. Paul Helliwell was the head of the Sea Supply Corporation, SEA, Southeast Asia Supply Corporation. He was full-time Central Intelligence Agency. Full-time Central Intelligence Agency.
So was this like pre-Iran-Contra or something?
All pre-Iran-Contra, all 1960.
But it was kind of like a precursor in some ways, because were they doing the same thing, using the profits to fund
back
other
ending?
revolutions?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so so they said, we can't do this without Trafficante, you know, being in charge of figuring out what to do about this. So they fly down, you know, Sam Giancana, Johnny Roselli, and Bob Mayhew fly down to Florida, and they have 3 sets of meetings at the Fontainebleau Hotel. Now, we're getting all of this directly from Trafficante, who turns out to be the client of the firm where I was. What are these Trafficante guys doing in the Watergate Hotel? Why are they there? You know, and so that's how I found out. So Trafficante's telling us all this, so that these are the facts of what happened.
Yeah.
Okay, so the bottom line is that he, after the second meeting, says, okay, I'm supportive of this in principle, but, you know, I didn't fall off no melon wagon, he said. So I wanted to make sure that this wasn't, his term, a brain fart. This wasn't some kind of brain fart, you know, of Howard Hughes, or much less Mayhew. You know, I needed to know this was coming directly from Nixon if we were going to do this. And so the next meeting shows up a guy at the third meeting that used the nom de guerre, Mr. Ed, and it was Sheffield Edwards, who's the chief of security of the Central Intelligence Agency. Okay, so he greenlights the creation of this assassination team that's designed to kill Castro, Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, and Che Guevara, and these other comandantes, right? And so that goes into motion. They agree to do that. And Trafficante figures out, okay, who am I going to put together on this team? He's smart. So what he does is he picks 15 guys that are all former gunmen from him down in Havana, who had fled with him up to Florida, who'd now been recruited by the Central Intelligence Agency to form this thing called Operation 40, which is this covert operation against Cuba, burning bridges, you know, lighting fires to their sugarcane fields, you know, poisoning the shipments of sugar going out, you know, doing everything to try to destroy the economy of that country, right? Because they were in defiance of Nixon, because they'd gone ahead and established diplomatic relations with both China and Russia. And so he wanted to, you know, to close down their economy, to show that, you know, a socialist economy couldn't function. So the bottom line is Trafficante contacts guys that have now been hired by the Central Intelligence Agency covertly to participate in Operation 40 in covert operations against Cuba. And he selects 15 of these people, which they call a code name, the S-Force.
So what happens between the S-Force and Castro?
Well, they're trying to figure out how to assassinate Castro.
Yeah.
They're trying to figure out all these different ways of doing it. But in the meantime, what happens is Nixon doesn't get elected. You know, and so that he doesn't get elected, and in comes Kennedy, you know, and brings in his brother Bobby as the Attorney General, right? And it turns out they don't know anything about this assassination team, because it's been set up completely off the shelf like this by Nixon, right? And so that everybody just steps back and lets that team keep on going, but the Kennedys don't know about it. And so that whole operation comes down. You know, they go through the whole Bay of Pigs thing. You know, that falls through. And Kennedy goes down and apologizes. It literally goes down to Miami in the Orange Bowl and gathers together all these hardcore right-wing Cubano refugees and apologizes to them for this, and promises them that the free flag of Cuba will fly over the island before the end of his second term. He says that to them, right? And he comes back, and even though he told Khrushchev that he was going to stop the covert operations going on against Cuba. He was going to shut down Operation 40. He wasn't going to do that anymore. You know, mea culpa, sorry for doing that. 40 with an operation called Mongoose. And they set it up over at the Miami campus, University of Miami campus, in this big hangar that's there, and that Mongoose runs there. And the guys that were doing the covert operations against Cuba still, included all the guys on the S-Force who had that other hat on.
Kennedy's aware of all of this and even directing some of it. How does it end up turning on him?
No, Kennedy wasn't aware of it at all.
At all? Okay.
At all.
Okay.
At all, until June 5th.
Okay.
Until June 5th of 1963
Okay.
was when he found out that Walter Sullivan told Bobby, about it, found out about it. And then Bobby tells John, but they didn't know about it until June 5th of 1963. So that thing is going on all that time, okay? And so that the smoke is cleared on the Bay of Pigs problem. But what happens, of course, is in October of 62, is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because Kennedy had lied to Khrushchev about shutting down Operation 40, and it just substituted Operation Mongoose, Nikita Khrushchev is totally pissed off. And so what he does is start...
But that's what I mean by Kennedy being aware. Is he's aware of Mongoose, but he's not aware of the S-Force.
Oh, no, but right. He knew about Mongoose.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that, but he didn't know about the S-Force.
So he doesn't know about the original intention to take out Castro.
No, he doesn't know anything about that.
Okay, got it.
Okay, and so the bottom line is that what happens is that Khrushchev is so pissed off over the fact that he's been lied to now by Kennedy, that he starts putting missiles into Cuba. Okay, and then when they find out about it in October, this whole thing comes down, which everybody knows about, and they come to within a hair's breadth of totally destroying the entire world. And Curtis LeMay and his guys, are coming up with Operation Northwoods and all that stuff of trying to figure out how to generate a war, with Russia. So the bottom line is Kennedy has to crush that whole operation to say, look, we've got to stop this. This is totally nuts. And so what he does is opens up a line of completely covert communications with Nikita Khrushchev. And he is promising him, look, you're right, I lied to you, but look, I'm telling you now, I'm telling you the truth. You and I need to do something about this. We've come just within a minute of destroying the entire planet. We've got to do something. And what they decided among themselves in an exchange of 18 different letters that went back and forth completely secretly, outside of the channels of the State Department, outside of the channels of the CIA, that he set up a completely private operation. Kennedy and Khrushchev to each other agreed that they were going to each use their respective authority as the executives of those two countries to start disassembling the nuclear warheads of their entire nuclear arsenals, because they were each personally so totally traumatized by what had happened, or almost happened. And so that they started getting ready to do that. And what happened is Allen Dulles found out about this, who had been the first civilian head of the CIA.
Yeah, and who hated Kennedy.
He hated Kennedy.
Yeah. Over Bay of Pigs. And
hated him, the Bay of Pigs, hated because he got fired.
Yeah.
But really, more importantly, and more sophisticatedly, was totally opposed to the disassembling of the nuclear warheads of the nuclear arsenal. Because they believed that they needed to have that against China, not against Russia. It's against China, because they'd already been shown, at the reservoir in Korea and at Incheon, that the Chinese could put 1 million men in uniform into the field against you. You couldn't do anything about it. You couldn't win a traditional land war against China. So they had to have the nuclear missiles. So they viewed Kennedy as a traitor. But he was getting set to disassemble the primary military capacity that the United States had, doing it covertly with the Soviets, i.e. Khrushchev personally. Okay? And they said, that's it, that's curtains. We can't wait for an election a year from now, a year and a half from now, in November of 64. We've got to get rid of him now. And so what they did is they tasked the S-Force that they knew existed, because Dulles knew that they existed, because Dulles was involved in it earlier on.